Imagine walking into a cafe to simply take care of your health, only to be publicly humiliated for doing so. That's exactly what happened to 72-year-old Grace Harris, a kind elderly woman whose simple act of administering her insulin led to a shocking confrontation. But what happened next? A stranger stepped in, and the events that unfolded changed everything. Stay with us to discover how an act of kindness sparked a wave of justice that no one saw coming. On a bright spring morning in Manhattan, the Artisan Bean Cafe stood as a polished sanctuary for the city's elite, nestled between designer boutiques and art galleries. Inside, the cafe exuded luxury with its marble counters, polished wood floors, and minimalist art lining the walls. The hum of quiet conversation mingled with soft jazz, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity. Patrons dressed in tailored suits and designer attire sipped on handcrafted lattes, their discussions blending seamlessly into the refined ambience. Through the sleek glass doors stepped Grace Harris, a 72-year-old black woman, her silver curls peeking from beneath a modest scarf. Her warm brown eyes surveyed the scene with quiet determination. Grace carried herself with the dignity of someone who had faced life's storms and survived. She wore a practical coat and clutched a well-worn purse, her presence barely noticed by the other patrons who were too engrossed in their rituals of self-indulgence. The walk from her doctor's appointment had been longer than expected, and she could feel the warning signs of dangerously high blood sugar levels, a sluggish heaviness, slight dizziness, and a growing sense of urgency to administer her insulin. Sliding into a corner booth, Grace exhaled softly, setting her purse on the polished table. The chair beneath her felt unyielding, but she was too focused on her health to notice. A young server approached, her bright smile warm and welcoming as she asked if Grace would like to order. "Chamomile tea, please," Grace said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. The server nodded cheerfully and disappeared into the bustling cafe. Grace pulled out her glucose monitor and insulin pen from her purse, her movements precise and deliberate, years of managing her diabetes having made the process second nature. As she began to prepare the pen, she felt a pair of eyes fixed on her. Across the room, Victor Palmer, the cafe's meticulous owner, watched her with a growing frown. Tall and sharply dressed in a tailored vest, Victor had built the Artisan Bean into an exclusive haven, and every detail of its operation reflected his pursuit of perfection. To him, Grace's presence disrupted the carefully curated image of his establishment. Misinterpreting her discreet movements, Victor muttered to himself and decided to intervene. He approached Grace's table with purposeful strides, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Casting a shadow over her table, he fixed her with an unwelcoming stare. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said coldly. "What are you doing?" Startled by his abrupt tone, Grace looked up and replied evenly, "I'm administering my insulin. I needed to manage my blood sugar levels." Victor's expression darkened, his voice tinged with irritation as he retorted, "This isn't the place for that. You're making the other customers uncomfortable." Grace's brow furrowed as she surveyed the room. No one seemed disturbed, but the weight of Victor's disapproval was palpable. "I'm not disrupting anyone," she said, her tone calm but firm. "This is a medical necessity." Victor crossed his arms, his annoyance barely concealed. "This is a cafe, not a medical facility. If you need to do that, I suggest you find somewhere else." Grace's chest tightened with a mix of indignation and disbelief. She steadied herself, determined not to let this man intimidate her. "I'm a paying customer," she said resolutely. "I've ordered tea, and I have every right to sit here and take care of my health." Victor's lips pressed into a thin line as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We cater to a certain kind of clientele here, ma'am. If you can't respect the environment, I'll have to ask you to leave." Grace's heart pounded as she held his gaze, her voice unwavering. "Your standards don't override my rights, and what you're doing is discriminatory." The tension in the room thickened as a few patrons glanced over, their curiosity piqued. The young server returned with Grace's tea, sensing the charged atmosphere. "Is everything all right here?" she asked cautiously, glancing between Grace and Victor. "We're fine," Victor snapped, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Grace's hands trembled slightly as the confrontation escalated, the stress compounding her worsening condition. She could feel her energy draining but refused to back down. "Call security if you must," she said, her voice steady despite the strain. "But I won't be bullied into leaving." Victor's patience wore thin as he stood over Grace, the weight of his frustration pressing heavily on the charged air of the cafe. "You think you can walk in here and do whatever you please?" he hissed, his tone sharp and accusatory. Grace remained seated, her silver curls catching the light as she straightened her posture, refusing to show weakness. Her voice, though calm, was filled with quiet strength as she replied, "I'm here to take care of my health, not to disrupt anyone. You're the one making a scene." The murmurs of nearby patrons grew louder, and a few people began pulling out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Victor glanced around, his face reddening as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "This is my cafe," he said, his voice rising. "And I have the right to enforce my rules." Before Grace could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "That's enough." All eyes turned to the speaker, a tall black man in his early 30s, impeccably dressed in a blazer and white shirt. Marcus Reed, a civil rights attorney, had been seated by the window, quietly observing the confrontation. His deep brown eyes were fixed on Victor, his expression a mix of calm authority and simmering anger. "What you're doing is not just wrong, it's illegal," Marcus said firmly, stepping closer to the booth. Victor's indignation flared as he turned to Marcus. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "It concerns everyone in this room who believes in decency and fairness," he said, his voice steady. "She's a paying customer with a medical condition, and you're discriminating against her." The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily in the air. Victor hesitated, his confidence faltering under Marcus's piercing gaze. Grace, meanwhile, felt a wave of relief mixed with exhaustion as Marcus's presence shifted the balance of power. But her body, weakened by stress and dangerously high blood sugar, began to betray her. Her vision blurred, and she gripped the edge of the table, struggling to stay upright. Marcus noticed immediately, his sharp instincts kicking in. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his tone filled with concern. I don't feel well," Grace murmured, her voice faint. Without hesitation, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed 911, relaying the details of the emergency to the dispatcher. "We need an ambulance at the Artisan Bean Cafe," he said, his tone urgent. "An elderly woman is experiencing a diabetic emergency." The cafe erupted into a flurry of activity as the young server rushed to Grace's side, her face pale with worry. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Get some water and a cold towel," Marcus instructed, his focus entirely on Grace. Victor, meanwhile, stood frozen, the gravity of the situation finally dawning on him. His earlier bravado crumbled as he muttered, "I didn't know it was this serious." Marcus turned to him, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. "You didn't bother to know," he said sharply. "All you cared about was your image." The shrill wail of approaching sirens filled the air as the ambulance pulled up outside the cafe, its flashing lights casting harsh reflections on the polished windows. Inside, Grace's condition continued to deteriorate, her breath shallow and labored. The paramedics rushed in, their movements efficient and precise as they assessed her vitals. Marcus stepped back to give them room but stayed close enough to offer any necessary information. "She's diabetic," he explained, his voice steady despite the tension. "Her blood sugar levels are dangerously high. She was trying to administer her insulin before this happened." One paramedic nodded, preparing a syringe of insulin while another checked Grace's pulse. The young server returned with a damp towel and a glass of water, her hands trembling as she handed them to Marcus. "Thank you," he said, his tone softer now. Gently, he pressed the cool towel against Grace's forehead, the small act of care a stark contrast to the chaos around them. The onlookers, many still clutching their phones, watched in stunned silence. Some whispered among themselves, while others filmed the paramedics at work. Outside, a crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and growing commotion. Victor remained by the counter, his face pale as he watched the scene unfold. "This is bad," he muttered to himself, his earlier arrogance replaced with visible unease. Marcus turned to him, his voice low but cutting. "Bad? A woman's life is at risk because of your prejudice. This isn't about your reputation, it's about accountability." Victor's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. The paramedic stabilized Grace enough to transport her, lifting her onto a stretcher with practiced care. Marcus followed closely as they wheeled her out to the waiting ambulance, his resolve unwavering. "I'm coming with her," he said firmly. The paramedics nodded, allowing him to climb into the vehicle. As the ambulance doors closed, sealing out the noise of the crowd, Marcus glanced at Grace's pale face. "You're going to be okay," he murmured, his tone steady. "I promise." Inside the ambulance, the air was thick with urgency as the paramedics worked to stabilize Grace. The glow of the city lights flashed through the windows, casting fleeting shadows across their determined faces. Marcus sat beside Grace, his tall frame barely fitting in the cramped space. His deep brown eyes never left her face as he held her frail hand, silently willing her to stay strong. "Her glucose levels are critical," one paramedic said, glancing at the monitor. "Administering insulin now." The other paramedic adjusted the flow of oxygen to Grace's mask, her shallow breaths a stark reminder of how close she was to a full medical crisis. Marcus felt a mix of anger and guilt swirling within him. He had intervened, but was it enough? The image of Victor's cold dismissal replayed in his mind, fueling his resolve to ensure Grace would receive justice. Grace stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering as she tried to speak. "What happened?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ambulance. Marcus leaned closer, his voice calm but firm. "You had a medical emergency, Ms. Harris. You're on your way to the hospital now. They're going to take care of you." Grace's fingers twitched weakly in his grasp, her fragile strength sending a wave of determination through him. "Thank you," she whispered before her eyes closed again. The paramedics exchanged a glance, their focus unbroken as they continued their work. Marcus watched silently, his thoughts a whirlwind of concern and purpose. The ambulance pulled into Manhattan General Hospital, and the paramedics wasted no time transferring Grace onto a gurney. Marcus followed closely as they wheeled her into the bright, sterile corridors of the emergency room. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced efficiency, their voices calm yet urgent as they assessed Grace's condition. "Patient is a 72-year-old female, diabetic emergency," one paramedic relayed. "Collapsed after delayed insulin administration. Glucose levels are stabilizing but still critical." Marcus lingered in the hallway, his hands clenched into fists as the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. Grace didn't deserve to face this alone, and he wouldn't let her. The atmosphere at Manhattan General Hospital was a mix of urgency and tense waiting as Marcus sat in the hospital's waiting room, scrolling through his phone while keeping one ear tuned for any updates on Grace's condition. The bright fluorescent lights overhead contrasted sharply with the growing weight of exhaustion that pressed on him, but his focus was unshaken. As he opened his social media feed, Marcus's phone buzzed with notifications. Curious, he clicked on a video link that was rapidly gaining traction. The footage was unmistakable, it was from the Artisan Bean Cafe. The video captured Victor Palmer standing over Grace, his words dripping with condescension and prejudice as Grace quietly tried to explain her medical need. It transitioned to Marcus's sharp intervention and finally showed the heartbreaking moment when Grace collapsed. Thousands of views had already accumulated, and the hashtags were impossible to ignore. #JusticeForGrace, #Indiscrimination, and #HealthWithDignity. Comments flooded the posts, filled with outrage and calls for accountability. "This could have been my grandmother," one person wrote. Another added, "It's 2024, and this is still happening? Unacceptable." Some comments tagged local media outlets, urging them to cover the story, while others included personal anecdotes of discrimination they had faced. Marcus's chest tightened as he read through the flood of responses. This was more than a moment, it was a movement in the making. Before Marcus could process the full scope of the video's impact, his phone rang. The hospital had successfully contacted Grace's grandson, Michael Harris, and the young man's worried voice filled Marcus's ear. "This is Michael," he said, his tone tight with urgency. "What happened? Is my grandma okay?" Marcus's response was steady and calming. "She's stable now, but she had a diabetic emergency. She's in good hands, and I'm here with her. You should come to Manhattan General as soon as you can." Michael's relief was audible, though his words were still thick with emotion. "Thank you for being there. I'm on my way." Hanging up, Marcus leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply, his thoughts a whirlwind. The viral storm was brewing fast, and he knew that while Grace's story was resonating with thousands, the fight for justice was just beginning. By the time Michael arrived at the hospital, the waiting room had emptied out slightly, the late-night hour leaving only a handful of people scattered in quiet anticipation. Marcus stood as the young man entered, recognizing him instantly from the photos Grace had shown him on her phone. Michael was in his late 20s, with short, neatly cropped hair and the tired but determined demeanor of someone juggling too many responsibilities at once. "You must be Marcus," Michael said, his voice a mix of gratitude and concern. "Thank you for staying with her." Marcus extended a firm handshake. "Of course. She's a remarkable woman, and she's lucky to have someone like you in her corner." Michael's eyes softened at the words, but his focus quickly shifted to his grandmother's condition. "Have you heard anything more?" he asked. "She's stable," Marcus reassured him. "They're running additional tests, but the worst seems to be over." As the two sat down, Marcus began explaining what had unfolded at the cafe, sparing no detail about Victor's actions. Michael's hands tightened into fists as he listened, his jaw clenching with anger. "She's been through enough already," he said, his voice low but trembling with emotion. "She didn't deserve this." Marcus placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, his tone steady and purposeful. "And that's why we're going to fight back. I've already contacted the Urban Justice Coalition. They specialize in cases like this, and they're ready to help us hold Victor accountable." Michael looked at Marcus, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination. "What do we need to do?" Marcus's response was firm. "First, we make sure Grace is fully on board. Then, we work with the coalition to build a solid case. This isn't just about one incident, it's about sending a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." Later that evening, Sandra Lee, a seasoned attorney from the Urban Justice Coalition, joined them at the hospital. With her sharp suit and no-nonsense demeanor, she exuded confidence as she outlined the plan. "We'll file a civil lawsuit for damages, both emotional and physical," Sandra explained. "We'll also submit a formal complaint to the city's Human Rights Commission. Victor's actions violated several anti-discrimination statutes, and we intend to make that crystal clear." Michael nodded, his resolve hardening. "Whatever it takes. My grandmother deserves justice." Marcus glanced at the room where Grace rested, his mind filled with a mix of relief and determination. This was only the beginning of a long battle, but with the coalition on their side, they had a real chance to make lasting change. The following weekend, the air outside the Artisan Bean Cafe was thick with energy as protesters filled the sidewalk, their voices rising in unison. Handwritten signs waved above the crowd, bearing slogans like "Justice for Grace," "No Room for Hate," and "Health with Dignity." The protest had been organized in less than 48 hours, thanks to social media and the growing wave of public outrage surrounding Grace's story. College students, families, retirees, and activists of all backgrounds stood together, chanting in solidarity. Michael stood near the edge of the crowd, holding a sign that read, "My grandmother deserves respect," his face a mix of pride and quiet anger. Marcus joined him, surveying the scene with a sense of purpose. "This is powerful," Marcus said, his voice steady. "People are showing up because they believe in this cause." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the makeshift stage at the front of the crowd. "She's the reason we're all here," he said softly. "She's the one who made this possible." A hush fell over the crowd as the next speaker stepped forward. Jessica Lang, a prominent diabetes advocate, took the microphone, her voice ringing out over the sea of people. "Grace Harris's story is not unique," Jessica began, her tone impassioned. "Every day, people with chronic illnesses face discrimination simply for managing their health. This is about more than one cafe or one incident. It's about changing the way we treat each other." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing down the busy Manhattan street. Marcus felt a surge of hope as he watched the diverse group of people rallying around Grace's story. This was more than a protest, it was a movement taking shape. As the speeches continued, Marcus and Michael moved through the crowd, connecting with attendees and sharing their gratitude. Every chant, every sign, every voice added fuel to the fight for justice, and Marcus knew they were only just beginning. Inside the hospital, Grace sat propped up in bed, her silver curls catching the soft light of the bedside lamp. A tablet rested on her lap, showing live footage of the protest outside the Artisan Bean Cafe. Her eyes welled with tears as she watched the sea of people chanting her name and holding signs demanding justice. "I never thought I'd see something like this," Grace said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Michael, seated beside her, reached over to squeeze her hand. "You've inspired them, Gran. You're giving people hope." Grace's gaze lingered on the screen, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her. "All I wanted was to take my insulin," she said softly. "I never wanted to be the center of attention." Marcus, standing near the foot of her bed, stepped forward, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You didn't ask for this, Grace, but your story has resonated with people because it's about more than what happened to you. It's about dignity, fairness, and the right to be treated with respect." Grace looked at Marcus, her warm brown eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I'm just an old woman from Harlem," she said. "What difference can I really make?" Marcus smiled, his expression unwavering. "You've already made a difference," he said. "Now it's about making sure that impact lasts." Grace leaned back against the pillows, her mind racing with thoughts of the past week. The pain of the incident at the cafe still lingered, but so did the overwhelming support she had received. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of purpose igniting within her. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady. "If people are willing to fight for me, I'll fight with them." Michael smiled, his pride evident as he leaned closer. "That's the Grace Harris I know." Together, the three of them began discussing the next steps, their determination growing stronger with each passing moment. Grace's journey was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The Artisan Bean Cafe sat eerily quiet, its once bustling interior now empty except for Victor Palmer, who paced behind the counter. The sign on the door read "Closed pending investigation," but the real damage was already done. The protest outside had grown larger each day, and the flood of online backlash showed no signs of slowing. Victor's carefully curated reputation as a sophisticated businessman had crumbled overnight, replaced by a public perception of prejudice and arrogance. The media had latched onto the story, amplifying it with new revelations from former employees and disgruntled customers. Victor's name was now synonymous with discrimination, and every attempt to control the narrative backfired. His hasty video apology, filmed in the dimly lit backroom of the cafe, only fueled the fire. Social media users picked it apart, calling it insincere and self-serving. "He's not sorry for what he did," one viral comment read. "He's sorry he got caught." Legal notices began piling up on his desk, letters from the Urban Justice Coalition, demands for statements from the Human Rights Commission, and even civil suits filed by other individuals who claimed to have experienced discrimination at his hands. Victor's lawyer urged him to settle quietly, but his pride kept him from admitting full responsibility. He muttered to himself as he sifted through the paperwork, his frustration mounting. "This is all being blown out of proportion," he said under his breath. But deep down, Victor knew the truth. He had built his business on the illusion of exclusivity, but that illusion had been shattered, exposing the ugliness beneath. Late at night, when the cafe was silent and the protests had died down, Victor found himself alone in his office, staring at a photo of the grand opening years ago. The faces in the photo were smiling, full of hope, but now those memories felt tainted. For the first time, Victor began to question the choices that had led him here. As the days passed, Grace Harris found herself at the heart of a growing movement. Her story had transcended the incident at the Artisan Bean Cafe, becoming a rallying cry for fairness and respect. Invitations poured in from advocacy groups, community centers, and even national organizations asking her to speak. Though the attention was overwhelming, Grace felt a responsibility to use her voice for good. Her first major public appearance was at a community town hall, where residents gathered to discuss issues of discrimination and public health. The room was packed, with standing room only as Grace approached the podium. Dressed in a modest yet elegant outfit, she looked out at the crowd, her warm brown eyes scanning the sea of faces. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "My name is Grace Harris," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I'm here today not because I wanted to be, but because I need to be." She recounted the events at the cafe, her words painting a vivid picture of the humiliation and fear she had felt. But as she spoke, her tone shifted from personal pain to collective resolve. "What happened to me is not unique," she continued. "It's a reflection of a society that too often overlooks the dignity of those who are different. But together, we can change that." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Grace's speech was not just a recounting of events but a call to action. She urged the crowd to stand up against injustice in their own lives, to support one another, and to demand better from their communities. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and Grace felt a swell of pride and relief. One by one, attendees approached her, sharing their own stories of discrimination or simply thanking her for her courage. A young woman in her 20s, tears streaming down her face, hugged Grace tightly. "You've given me hope," she said. "Thank you for standing up for all of us." That night, as Grace returned home, she reflected on how far she had come. The road ahead was uncertain, but she felt a newfound sense of purpose. Her voice had been heard, and she was determined to keep speaking. The momentum surrounding Grace's story showed no signs of slowing. Advocacy groups across the country reached out, eager to collaborate on campaigns addressing public health stigma and discrimination. Grace found herself juggling a packed schedule of events, interviews, and meetings with community leaders. Marcus worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating her appearances and ensuring she had the support she needed. One evening, Grace and Marcus sat together in her modest Harlem apartment, surrounded by letters from supporters. Michael joined them, sorting through the pile as they discussed their next steps. "We've been invited to the National Diabetes Awareness Summit," Marcus said, sliding a flyer across the table. "It's one of the largest platforms for public health advocacy in the country. Thousands of people will be there, and it'll be streamed online." Grace hesitated, her fingers brushing over the flyer. "Marcus, I'm just one person," she said softly. "What can I possibly say to all those people?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression filled with conviction. "Grace, you've already inspired so many. This is your chance to amplify that message. To show the world that one voice can spark change." Michael nodded, his gaze steady as he spoke. "Gran, you've taught me my whole life to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Now it's your turn." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for the two men who had stood by her side through everything. "All right," she said, her voice resolute. "Let's do it." The summit was held in a sprawling convention center, its halls filled with booths and banners promoting diabetes education and awareness. When it was Grace's turn to speak, the large auditorium was packed. The stage lights were bright, but Grace stood tall, her silver curls gleaming under the spotlight. As she began to speak, her voice carried a mix of vulnerability and strength, weaving her personal story into a broader call for empathy and action. By the time she finished, the audience was on their feet, their applause thunderous. Grace stepped off the stage to find Marcus and Michael waiting for her, their faces glowing with pride. "You were incredible," Marcus said. "Absolutely incredible." Amid the growing movement, Grace received an unexpected letter. It was from Victor Palmer. She opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The letter was written in a formal tone, but the words carried a surprising sincerity. "Dear Ms. Harris," it began, "I want to offer my deepest apologies for the way I treated you. My actions were wrong, and I realize now how much harm I caused. I know I can't undo what happened, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Grace sat in her living room, the letter resting in her lap as she processed its contents. Forgiveness had always been a core value for her, but the pain Victor had caused was still fresh. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not ready to forgive but unwilling to close the door entirely. A week later, Marcus informed her that Victor had requested a meeting. "He says he wants to apologize in person," Marcus explained. "It's up to you, Grace." After a moment of thought, Grace agreed. They met at a small, neutral cafe far removed from the opulence of the Artisan Bean. Victor arrived looking nervous, his usual air of confidence replaced by visible remorse. "Miss Harris," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know no words can make up for what I did, but I needed to say this face to face. I'm truly sorry. Grace studied him carefully, searching his expression for authenticity. Mr. Palmer, she said finally, her tone measured, forgiveness isn't easy, and it doesn't erase what happened. But I believe people can change if they're willing to put in the work. Victor nodded, his gratitude evident. I am. I promise you that I am. As they parted ways, Grace felt a sense of closure beginning to form. It wasn't complete, but it was a start. The ripple effect of Grace's story had grown into a tidal wave, and the movement it inspired began taking concrete shape. Across the country, advocacy groups rallied behind her, organizing events, creating educational campaigns, and pushing for legislation to address discrimination in public spaces. The hashtags #JusticeForGrace and #HealthWithDignity were no longer just slogans, they had become symbols of a nationwide call to action. Grace herself became the face of the movement, her voice amplified by the people and organizations who shared her vision. She traveled to cities big and small, speaking at town halls, schools, and conferences, where her message resonated with audiences of all ages and backgrounds. At one event in Chicago, a high school auditorium was packed with students and teachers eager to hear her speak. As Grace stepped onto the stage, the murmurs of the crowd faded into a respectful silence. She began by recounting her experience at the Artisan Bean Cafe, her voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened to me is not unique, she said, her words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. But it's a reminder of what happens when we fail to see each other's humanity. We have the power to change that, one act of kindness, one stand against injustice at a time. When she finished, the applause was deafening, and one by one, students rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Afterward, a young girl approached Grace, her voice trembling as she spoke. Ms. Harris, I have diabetes too, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I used to feel ashamed of taking care of myself in public, but hearing your story makes me feel less alone. Grace hugged the girl tightly, her own eyes glistening. You're never alone, she said gently. And you should never feel ashamed for taking care of your health. The moment solidified Grace's resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel small or unwelcome for simply existing. Each interaction, each story shared, added fuel to the fire, and the movement continued to grow, united by a shared commitment to dignity and respect for all. While Grace's movement thrived, Victor Palmer was undergoing a transformation of his own. The fallout from the incident had been swift and brutal. The Artisan Bean Cafe remained closed, and Victor's once glamorous reputation was now irreparably tarnished. He had lost not only his business but also the respect of his peers and community. At first, Victor resisted taking responsibility, clinging to his pride and blaming the backlash on public overreaction. But as weeks turned into months, the weight of his actions began to sink in. The stories shared by former employees and customers painted a damning picture of his behavior, and Victor was forced to confront the reality of the toxic environment he had fostered. He started attending workshops on bias and discrimination, initially out of obligation but eventually with genuine curiosity. The sessions were eye-opening, filled with raw, unfiltered stories from people who had faced prejudice and marginalization in their daily lives. For the first time, Victor listened, really listened, to the pain caused by actions like his. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Victor sat alone in his now empty cafe. The space felt hollow, stripped of the life and energy it once had. He stared at the polished wood counters and remembered how proud he had been when the cafe first opened. What have I done? He murmured to himself, the weight of regret pressing heavily on his chest. Determined to make amends, Victor reached out to local community organizations, offering his resources and time to support their initiatives. He began volunteering at shelters and food drives, slowly rebuilding his connection to the community he had alienated. Though the journey was painful and humbling, Victor felt a flicker of hope that he could one day make things right. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the atmosphere inside the courthouse was charged with anticipation. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras trained on the proceedings, while supporters of Grace's movement gathered outside, holding signs and chanting slogans. Grace sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Marcus and Sandra Lee, who had worked tirelessly to prepare for this moment. Across the aisle, Victor sat alone, his once confident demeanor replaced by a quiet resignation. Sandra presented a compelling case, detailing the emotional and physical harm Grace had endured and citing the video evidence that had captured the discrimination in vivid detail. Witnesses from the cafe testified, some recounting Victor's history of exclusionary behavior, while others spoke of the courage Grace displayed that day. Victor's lawyer argued that his actions were a misunderstanding rather than malicious intent, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the judge delivered the ruling, the room fell silent. The court finds the defendant, Victor Palmer, guilty of discriminatory practices and orders him to pay substantial damages to the plaintiff, Grace Harris. Furthermore, the court mandates that Mr. Palmer participate in anti-discrimination training and community service as part of his restitution. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the courtroom. Grace closed her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of the moment sank in. Justice had been served, but for her, the victory was about more than compensation. It was about setting a precedent that would protect others. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers as the news spread. Grace emerged to a flurry of applause and camera flashes, but her focus was on the people who had stood by her side throughout the ordeal. Marcus and Michael flanked her, their faces glowing with pride as they joined her in addressing the crowd. "This victory isn't just mine," Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "It belongs to everyone who has ever faced injustice. Together, we've shown that standing up for what's right can change the world." With the legal battle behind her, Grace turned her attention fully to the movement that had grown from her story. Advocacy groups and local governments began implementing policies inspired by her case, addressing discrimination in public spaces and promoting awareness of chronic illnesses. Grace became a sought-after speaker, traveling across the country to share her journey and advocate for systemic change. At one event in Washington, D.C., she stood before a packed auditorium filled with activists, lawmakers, and community leaders. "This isn't the end of the fight," she said, her voice filled with determination. "It's the beginning of a new chapter, one where dignity and respect are not privileges but rights for everyone." Her words were met with thunderous applause, and as Grace stepped off the stage, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Back in Harlem, Grace's modest apartment had become a hub of activity, filled with letters from supporters and plans for future campaigns. Michael, now fully immersed in the movement, worked alongside her to organize events and build partnerships with other organizations. "Gran, you've created something incredible," Michael said one evening as they sorted through letters. "You've given people a reason to believe in change." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We've done this together," she said. "And we're just getting started." The ripple effects of Grace's fight continued to spread, inspiring countless others to stand up against injustice in their own lives. Her story had become a symbol of resilience and courage, a testament to the power of one voice to ignite a movement. The air was buzzing with excitement as Grace Harris arrived at a bustling community center in Atlanta, where a national summit on public health and discrimination was being held. The event was the culmination of months of advocacy, bringing together leaders, activists, and policymakers inspired by Grace's story. As she walked through the crowd, Grace was greeted with smiles, handshakes, and words of gratitude. The walls were adorned with posters bearing slogans like "Health with Dignity" and photos of Grace standing at protests and speaking at events. Marcus and Michael accompanied her, the pride in their eyes evident as they navigated the packed venue. Grace's speech was the highlight of the day, drawing an audience that spilled out of the main hall and into adjoining rooms where the event was being streamed. As she took the stage, a hush fell over the crowd, the weight of her presence filling the space. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "When I walked into a cafe that day, I never imagined that my life would change so drastically. But what began as an act of humiliation became a call to action, not just for me, but for all of us." Grace recounted the events with clarity and emotion, weaving her personal story into a broader narrative about systemic discrimination and the importance of empathy. Her words resonated deeply, and as she concluded, the audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. After the speech, attendees lined up to meet her, many sharing how her story had inspired them to take action in their own communities. One woman, a nurse from Chicago, said, "Ms. Harris, because of you, my hospital is implementing new policies to support patients with chronic illnesses. You've made a real difference." Grace clasped the woman's hand, her eyes glistening. "It's people like you who turn ideas into action. Thank you for being part of this fight." That night, as she sat with Marcus and Michael in her hotel room, Grace reflected on how far they had come. "We've built something bigger than I ever imagined," she said softly. "And it's only the beginning." Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You've shown the world what's possible when people come together. That's a legacy that will last." Victor Palmer's journey toward redemption was not without its challenges. After the court ruling, he had been thrust into the harsh glare of public scrutiny, with his actions dissected in media reports and online forums. At first, he resisted the weight of his mistakes, but the isolation and loss of his business forced him to confront the reality of his actions. Determined to change, Victor began volunteering at local shelters and attending community meetings focused on bias and inclusion. His initial reluctance gave way to genuine engagement as he listened to the stories of people who had faced discrimination. One day, Victor found himself at a community forum where Grace was speaking. Though he stayed in the back, the power of her words struck him deeply. After the event, he approached her cautiously, his usual confidence replaced by humility. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice trembling, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that your story has changed me. I'm trying to do better." Grace studied him for a moment before replying. "Change doesn't come easy, Mr. Palmer. But the fact that you're here says something. Keep listening, and keep learning." Victor nodded, his gratitude evident. Over the following months, Victor continued his efforts to rebuild, partnering with local advocacy groups to support initiatives aimed at combating discrimination. Though his path was long and fraught with challenges, he found a sense of purpose in the work. For the first time in years, he felt that he was contributing to something meaningful. Victor's transformation, while imperfect, became a small but significant part of the larger movement inspired by Grace's story. As the movement gained momentum, Grace's life became a whirlwind of activity. She was constantly traveling, speaking at events, and meeting with leaders across the country. Though the pace was exhausting, Grace felt energized by the impact her work was having. Michael, now a full-time advocate, became her closest ally, helping to organize events and manage their growing network of supporters. One evening, back in Harlem, Grace and Michael sat in their apartment, surrounded by plans for an upcoming national conference. "Gran," Michael said, his tone filled with admiration, "you've turned something terrible into something extraordinary. People look up to you." "I look up to you." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "And I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You've been my rock through all of this." The next day, Grace attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community health center named in her honor. The Grace Harris Center for Health and Wellness was the result of months of collaboration between advocacy groups, local leaders, and healthcare providers. The center's mission was to provide accessible care for individuals with chronic illnesses and to promote education and understanding about the challenges they faced. As Grace cut the ribbon, surrounded by cheers and applause, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The center was more than a building, it was a symbol of everything they had fought for. That evening, as she stood by the window of her apartment, watching the city lights twinkle against the dark sky, Grace felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead was still long, but she knew they were on the right path. The culmination of Grace's journey came at a national awards ceremony, where she was being honored for her contributions to social justice and public health advocacy. The event was held in a grand hall filled with leaders, activists, and dignitaries. As Grace took the stage to accept her award, the audience erupted in applause, their admiration for her palpable. Standing under the bright lights, Grace spoke from the heart. "This award isn't just for me," she said, her voice steady and filled with emotion. "It's for everyone who has ever faced discrimination, for everyone who has stood up for what's right, and for everyone who believes in the power of unity. Together, we've proven that one voice can make a difference, but many voices can change the world." As the ceremony concluded, Grace was surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, all eager to share in the moment. Michael stood by her side, his pride evident as he embraced her. "You've done something incredible, Gran," he said softly. "You've shown the world what courage looks like." Grace smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "And now it's up to all of us to keep it going." In the days that followed, Grace continued her work, speaking at events and inspiring new generations of advocates. Her story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. As her movement continued to grow, Grace remained humble, always focused on the people whose lives she had touched. Her legacy was not just in the laws that were changed or the centers that were built, it was in the hearts of those who had found the strength to stand up and demand better. As Grace's journey reached its final chapter, she looked back with gratitude for the people who had stood by her side, the challenges she had overcome, and the impact she had made. Her story was far from over, but she knew that together, they had already accomplished something extraordinary. Thank you for following Grace's journey. Let us know in the comments what you thought of her story. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this. And click on the card to watch our next story.